very happy to have my brother-in-law Madhav Deshpande to give us this session on Sanskrit, its history, and so on. Many of you know him. He is a world-renowned Sanskrit scholar, and he has written books that are used by. I think that we have one Swamiji here who used his book for Sanskrit, the initial uh, teaching. He is currently he's a professor emeritus at Ann Arbor, and he has moved to Chicago, moved to California, and there he's a visiting professor at Stanford University. He has also been visiting professor both at uh, uh, Oxford and also Harvard. And overall, he is considered as one of the best resources in Sanskrit and Indian scriptures. So, with that, Madhav, thank you for uh, the offering this your session to Sri Yoga, and you can go ahead. Thank you.
Hey, thank you, Sri. Uh, at the beginning, I want to say that my talk is going to be more in the nature of how a professor of Sanskrit might speak rather than a religious leader or Vedantian or something, a yogi or something like that. So, my approach is going to be that of a pretty much a historian of Sanskrit and someone who has a disciplinary background of the field of linguistics. So I'm going to focus more on Sanskrit as a language rather than a philosophy and religion and mysticism, and all those things do exist in Sanskrit. But today I will be focusing on Sanskrit as a language and its history and prehistory. So let's, with that, uh, Shrikant, if you can share that document. Okay, you have to, okay. All right, this just explains to you my academic background. I was professor of Sanskrit and linguistics at the University of Michigan from 1972 until 2017. And uh, after that, for 2 years, I was a visitor at Stanford. And now I'm teaching from home several students, and I'm talking to you from Campbell in California. Okay, so let's look at the next slide. Okay, so we are used to calling this language by the term Samskrita, uh, and we think that's the term forever. From the beginning of this language, the same term was used. That's not the case. The term Samskrita is relatively late as referring to language. Uh, it was used in earlier Vedic texts and Panini's grammar uses it, but not in reference to language. It means something like cultured, processed, enhanced. It was a ritually cooked food, etc. in the earlier Vedic literature, but not in reference to language. Now we'll see where the first reference, first usage of Sanskrit in reference to language comes. Okay, let's look at the next one. Okay, so Ramayana, Valmiki's Ramayana is the first text that uses the term Samskrita in relation to language. And even here, it looks like it's used more as an adjective rather than as the name of a language. And here is a kind of a funny episode. Sita is in Ashoka Vana in Lanka, and Hanuman has crossed the ocean, and he is sitting on the tree, and he's thinking in which language should he talk to Sita. And this is kind of an interesting. He says, "Okay, should I speak in Sanskrit? Should I speak in this?" And he says, "Yadi vacham pradasyami, Shubhangi, the off कर."
trying to mute. That's not how.
Okay. So this so Hanuman said that if I use a cultured speech, Sanskritam Vacham, to talk, Shubhangi, you have to turn off the speakers. Okay. नहीं तो ये बंद कर कंप्यूटर बंद कर दो because it is giving feedback. Okay, ते बंद करून टाकते. So Hanuman says, Shubhangi, there is feedback, please.
I cannot find it.
Okay. So Hanuman says, if I use the cultured speech, Sanskritam Vacham, then Sita will think that I'm a Brahmin, but Ravana is a Brahmin. And she might think that I'm Ravana. So I should not use Sanskrita Vak to talk to Sita. So, of course, the entire Ramayana is written in Sanskrit. And so, in Valmiki Ramayana, of course, Hanuman speaks to Sita in Sanskrit. But this is an interesting question that he raises. And here is the first time that the word Samskrita is referred in reference to speech. Okay, let's look at the next one. The next most important text that uses Sanskrit as the name of a language is a work on Sanskrit poetics called Kavyadarsha. And Kavyadarsha was composed by Dandin in 800 AD from Tamil region. And he says, Sanskritam nama daivi vak. Sanskrita is a divine speech. And in literature, which languages are used? And it says Sanskritam, Prakritam, Apabhramsha, and Deshi regional languages. It says they are all languages appropriate to be used in literature. So this is not only the first use of Sanskrit as the name of a language, but it also tells us that Sanskrit did not exist in a kind of a vacuum. It always existed along with other languages. Uh, those languages were Prakrit, sometimes they were uh, South Indian, Dravidian languages, and so on and so forth. But Sanskrit never existed alone without any other language in the context. And we'll get back to this. Okay. So the next slide. All right. So I'm just briefly going to refer to religious conceptions that are attached to Sanskrit. So there are two interesting conceptions. One is that the Vedas, particularly, are called apaurushaya, that they are not creation of human beings, but the term is not limited to human beings. Even Ishvara is considered to be a Purusha, he is a Purushottama, but according to this view of Mimamsa, the Vedas are not the words of even Ishvara, that they are a standalone, eternal entity. They exist forever. They are not subject to creation and disappearance. They are permanently there. And that's the meaning of the term Aparushaya. They are not even composed by Ishwar. So let's look at the next slide. The other interesting religious view, this belongs to Indian logicians. Uh, these are the traditions of Nyaya and Vaisheshika. And Nyaya and Vaisheshika argue. First, they argue for the existence of Ishvara. Who are they fighting against? They are fighting against the Buddhists and the Jains who reject Ishvara as understood by Hinduism. And the Nayayika, the logicians, try to establish existence of Ishvara by using logic. Once they do that, then they say Vedas are words of this Ishvara, and therefore they are eternal. but they are words of Ishvara. And Mimamsa says, no, 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 they're not words of Ishvara. They are standalone, eternal entities. Nyaya and Vaisheshika tradition says, no, they are words of Ishvara. And so these are sort of theological arguments between these ancient traditions. Whichever tradition we look at, the Vedas are essentially seen as being eternal, at least to the extent that they begin with creation. They coexist with Ishvara. Uh, and that is the religious view. And let's look at the next slide. Okay. So, in if we take this view that the Vedas are completely eternal, not composed by any human being, that I would label it as a religious and theological view. If you look at the contents of the Vedas, if you look inside the Vedas, what are the Vedas saying? Who are the Rishis? What are they saying about themselves? We find that the Rishis who are whose names are attached to various hymns call themselves by the term Karu. And the word Karu comes from the verb karoti, to make, to create. And the word Karu refers to craftsmen. So these are poets who consider themselves to be kind of artistic uh, craftsmen of language. And they call the another term that comes into use in slightly later times is mantra krut. They are makers of mantra. The Veda itself has this phrase. How did the Rishis produce this speech? Manasa vacham akrata. Akrata again the root karoti, that they created this speech with their mind. And so inside the Vedas, inside the Rig Veda, the view seems to be that the Rishis are calling themselves to be creators of the hymns. Uh, Not simply that they received the hymns in their meditative stance, but they are the creators of it. They are inspired by the various divinities, but they call themselves Karu, the creators. Okay, let's look at the next one. However, as time goes by, within late Vedic and post-Vedic literature, the approach to Rishi changes. The Rishis are no longer looked at as creators, authors of the hymns, but they are looked at as those who saw the hymns. The hymns were already there in some divine form, they already existed, and the Rishis in their trance, they saw the hymns. So the word Rishi itself gets then derived from the verb drush pashyati, that they saw the Vedas rather than being the creators of the Vedas. So this is a kind of a change in the notion of who the Rishis are and what their function is. So in late Vedic and post-Vedic times, they are seen as literally as seers rather than authors of the Veda. Okay, all right. So if you take this kind of a traditional religious theological view that the Vedas are absolutely eternal, then there is no point in looking for history in the Veda or history of the Veda from both sides. And someone like Lokmanya Tilak in India, uh, by looking at references to stars and constellations, tried to figure out uh, the history of the Veda, what might be the time frame. So Tilak came up with something like 8 to 10,000 BC as the time frame. And Tilak's idea was that at least part of the Veda was composed close to the North Pole and where the night and the day was 6 months each. But today that view is not held. And yet, of course, modern scholars are looking for history of the Veda. And any notion or any attempt to look for history of the Veda often gets uh, opposed by the religious view, which says, no, 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 they are absolutely eternal. Don't look for history of the Vedas and don't look for history in the Veda. Okay. So this kind of opposition of modern attempts to find history of the Veda and the view that the Vedas are absolutely eternal or created by God. You know, this is a kind of a stand-up which exists not only in Hinduism, it's there in biblical history, is there in Islam, is there in any number of other religious traditions. Okay, so let's move ahead. All right. So when I'm talking about history of the Veda, essentially we have to step out of that religious and theological view and then look at the language of the Vedas. That's what I'm primarily going to look at. So uh, by modern estimates, and again, these estimates are approximate and they vary by a few centuries here and there, but something like 2000 to 1500 BC is the oldest compositions of the Veda, the Rig Veda especially, is the oldest composition. And the Upanishads come sometime close to 500, 400 BC. So we have approximately a period of 1000 to 1500 years, traveling from the oldest parts, the Rig Veda, coming up to the latest part, the Upanishads. Okay. Now, what do we see inside the Veda? And I'm not looking at the religious contents so much as something that will allow us to put Vedas in history. And what we find is that there are enormous geographical references within the hymns of the Rig Veda, which is the oldest collection within the Veda. So what do we find? The Veda refers to rivers ranging from the river Kubha, which is Kabul, from there to Sindhu and tributaries of Sindhu and coming up to Ganga and Yamuna. And Ganga and Yamuna, not all the way through the entire length of Ganga and Yamuna, but the early part of Ganga and Yamuna. So from Kabul up to Ganga and Yamuna is the region that the Vedic poets, the Rishis, are living on the banks of the rivers and composing their hymns. Uh, Now, when we come to later Vedas, the Yajur Veda, parts of the Yajur Veda, the so-called Shukla Yajur Veda, some of the Upanishads, the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, for example, it is composed in the region of what is today Bihar. Uh, in ancient times, it was called Videha and Magadha. So Yajnavalkya, who is the protagonist in uh, main speaker in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, he is from the region of Videha. He is at the court of the king Janaka. And so what we see is that the Rig Veda sort of ends almost on the border of Punjab, but other Vedas and Upanishads have further migrated into northern India in the eastern direction. Okay. So here is a map that gives you some idea of the rivers that are mentioned in the Rig Veda, the oldest. So it is all this northwestern part. Some of this is now part of northern Pakistan, partly in the regions of border regions of Afghanistan, the Kabul region, for example. Uh, this is pretty much the region of the Rig Veda. And uh, then later Vedas and later Upanishads coming, Brihadaranyaka, for example, uh, we are reaching Videha and Magadha into Bihar. Okay. Okay. So the branches of Vedas, the Vedas were carried by different groups of Brahmins and they migrated at different speeds and from different locations to different locations. So they spread out. They spread out in various regions, initially of northern India, and then gradually further into southern parts of India. So as this migration, gradual migration of the Rishis and their communities takes place, the local languages and the language of the mother tongues of the Rishi are coming into contact, and gradually the mother tongues of the users of Sanskrit go on changing. Uh, and Sanskrit becomes a kind of a language of literature, philosophy, and so on, ritual. But the mother tongue, the tongues languages used at home are not necessarily the same as Sanskrit. And we'll see some interesting evidence for this. Okay. So again, this map gives you some idea of Gandhara at one end. So the Rig Veda is composed from Gandhara up to sort of the boundaries of modern Punjab and Haryana. And then you look at Panchala and Kosala and Videha and see Magadha, Videha. This is the region where Brihadaranyaka Upanishad is composed. And you can see the whole stretch. And then gradually then many branches of the Vedas percolate towards south. If you can see the map, what you see is that, for example, the Taittiriya Yajurveda, you see that in the north. Because if you look at the contents of Taittiriya Yajurveda, it refers to northern India. But today, Taittiriya Yajurveda survives only in South India. It is completely absent in North India. And so that gives you a sense of how these communities uh, carrying different branches of the Vedas have traveled within India. Okay. All right. Now we are going to briefly look at the modern linguistic approach to the history and prehistory of Sanskrit. So this prehistory of Sanskrit, according to modern linguistics, fits within a broad language family, and this language family is called Indo-European language family. And I'll tell you briefly about how this idea developed. So Indo-European means languages from India up to Europe, and languages, many of them in between. For example, a Western of the Parsi scriptures, old Farsi, old Persian language, languages in Anatolia, uh, modern Turkey, languages like Hittite, uh, and then Greek and Latin, and coming up to modern languages all the way from Russian, Armenian, Greek, German, and even English. All these languages ultimately belong to a common language family. But that means that at some point in time, way back in the past, a few thousand years ago, they had a common ancestor. And then they gradually developed as dialects. They started differentiating from each other and migrating into different regions of the world. Okay, let's look at the next. So, who came up with this idea for the first time? It is the name of this William Jones that is attached to this idea as the initiator of this idea. William Jones was a High Court judge in Calcutta, and he was among the first few British officers who took it upon themselves to study Sanskrit. And once they studied Sanskrit in Calcutta, they came to this kind of realization that they had already studied Farsi, they had studied Greek and Latin at Oxford and Cambridge before they came to India, and Bengali was the local language. And William Jones suddenly realized the similarity that exists between all these languages. And he came to conclude, and he gave a speech in Calcutta in 1786, arguing that the similarities between these languages could not have been a result of some accident, not randomly, but there must have been a common source, common ancestor for all these languages. And that common ancestor is now theoretically reconstructed. We don't have that language in our hand, but we can reconstruct that common ancestor by comparing the surviving languages. Okay. So what happens? The original speakers of this Indo-European, Proto-Indo-European language family are lived somewhere near Aral Sea and Black Sea. That's the reconstruction by comparison of various languages. And from there, different branches, different dialect groups start migrating away. Some go to the west, some go south, and some go east. And many branches develop. So French and Latin belong to one branch, German and English belong to another branch, Russian belongs to the Slavic branch, and so on and so forth. So one of these branches first comes into Central Asia, and from Central Asia it comes southward, comes into regions of Afghanistan, and then it goes, one branch goes east into India, the other branch goes west into Iran. And so Indo-Iranian is a sub-branch of this Indo-European language family. What goes under Indo-Iranian? It is the old Farsi language, old Western language of the Farsi religion, and the language of the Vedas and Sanskrit. These languages go within Indo-Iranian. Okay, let's look at the next. Okay, so this is just a chart uh, showing one kind of reconstruction of linguistic history based on comparison of these languages. And more recently, there has been work on genetics and archaeology and trying to mesh the conclusions of linguistics with archaeology and, uh, and genetics. Uh, and this recent work kind of goes hand in hand with some of these things that you see in this chart. So uh, two branches are coming here, one going into Iran, the other going into the Mohenjo-daro in that region, and then into further India. That is the branch that represents Vedic and Sanskrit. Okay, okay. So this branch that comes into India is called in linguistics the Indo-Aryan branch. The Indo-Aryan branch, the oldest surviving material of Indo-Aryan branch is the Vedic literature and Sanskrit that we find in later times. And then the languages that are called Prakrits, ancient Prakrits, the first time we see them in actual use are in inscriptions of the Emperor Ashoka. And then Prakrit languages develop into Apabhramsha, and Apabhramsha develops into regional languages of North India that we know today. So from Punjabi to Hindi to Bengali, Assamese, and then coming south to Marathi and Gujarati. All these languages are development from Prakrit languages. And Prakrit and Sanskrit are like sisters, ancient sisters of each other. They coexisted from ancient times. Okay, all right. Again, this is just to give you a geographic sense of how these languages are coming in. So here you have this arrow showing this Indo-Aryan branch coming into India and how it comes from the northwest but gradually migrates towards east and further into south. Okay. As a result of these ancient migrations, what happens is large parts of India are occupied by today by descendant Indo-Aryan languages. So you see Marathi is the southernmost, and then you have Punjabi and Kashmiri and Dogri and Pahari and Nepali, Assami, that's the northernmost here. And then you have Bengali, Hindi and Rajasthani, Sindhi and Oriya. All these languages are descendants of Prakrit, ancient Prakrit languages. And Prakrit is connected with Sanskrit as a sister language from ancient times. Further south, you have Dravidian languages. Further north, you have Tibetan languages. So, India sits, the Indo-Aryan languages sit between Tibetan language on the north and Dravidian languages on the south. Okay, all right. So, again, looking at the language of the Vedas, what we find is, I briefly mentioned that the period of the Vedas is something like 1500, could be a few hundred years one way or the other, because we don't have an absolute dates. These are all approximate estimations. Something like 1500 to 1000 years. Within that period, what you find is the oldest literature is the hymns of the Rigveda. So that goes closer to 1500, 1700 BC, something like this. Then we come to parts of the Yajurveda that are in prose, like the Taittiriya Samhita of Yajurveda, for example. Uh, that is linguistically later than the language of the Rigveda. We can see from the changing grammar and vocabulary that it has developed after a few centuries. And that's, in linguistics, we call it Middle Vedic language. And when we come to the so-called Brahmanas and Upanishads, like the language of Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, for example, uh, that language is the late part of the Vedic period. That language comes closest to language as known to Panini, closest to the language of Mahabharata and what we call Sanskrit later on. It's not identical with it, but it's very close. On the other hand, the language of the Rig Veda is very difficult because it goes way far back. A lot of vocabulary of the Rig Veda has become obsolete in Sanskrit. Lot of grammar of the Rig Veda has become obsolete in later Sanskrit. So to study Rig Veda, it is not just enough to study the language of Mahabharata and Panchatantra and Kalidas. You need to make very special effort to learn the language of this very old language. Uh, and it's like just as modern English, English of Shakespeare, English of Chaucer, you know, tell us stages of the development of English. From Marathi, from Jnaneshwar Marathi to Marathi of Tukaram, Marathi of Lokmanya Tilak and Marathi of today. We can see changing, slowly changing vocabulary, slowly changing grammar. Some grammar goes obsolete, some vocabulary goes obsolete. Something like that has happened to the Vedas and to Sanskrit. Okay. Okay. So we are again briefly going to look at the grammarians of Sanskrit. So the oldest grammar of Sanskrit that has survived in completeness is the grammar of Panini. And Panini lived somewhere around 400 BC. All these are approximate dates. His time frame is slightly before the invasion of Alexander, uh, slightly before Ashokan Empire. Uh, so by estimate, it's somewhere around 400, 500 BC. The language that Panini describes, he describes two phases of language. He says, in the Veda, this happens, but in the spoken colloquial Sanskrit, this is what happens. So he's describing mainly two phases. The general rules of Panini apply to both the Veda and the contemporary colloquial Sanskrit. But there are exception rules that say in Vedic this happens, but not in the colloquial, or this happens in the colloquial language, but not in the Veda. So Panini's grammar can be sorted out in these three types of rules. Rules that apply across the board to contemporary colloquial Sanskrit and to the language of the Veda, and then special rules that apply only to the Veda and special rules that apply only to the contemporary language. So that's the structure of Panini's grammar. Then around 300 BC comes the next grammarian. His name is Katyayana, and the most important grammarian uh, is Patanjali. So it's the same name for the founder of the author of the Yoga Sutras. Sometimes the same name is given to the author of the Charaka Samhita of Ayurveda, and a notion develops that the same Patanjali taught all these three branches of Shastras. But it's not entirely clear that it's one and the same Patanjali. It could be three different individuals with the same name. Uh, there is not enough evidence in our hands to say that it's exactly the same Patanjali. So Patanjali comes slightly after the fall of the Mauryan Empire. And these three founding grammarians are later called the three Munis of Sanskrit grammar. What happens is Panini was not the first grammarian because he refers to 9 other grammarians before his time and he quotes their rules. But their grammars are completely lost. So, among the surviving grammars of Sanskrit, Panini's grammar is now the oldest that has survived. And it is studied continuously from 400-500 BC until today. And our understanding of Sanskrit is now primarily based on the grammar of Panini. Okay. Okay. Now, the grammar of Panini teaches a form of Sanskrit uh, that is, let's say, the high end, the elite, literary, standard, upper class. Again, we can characterize this in multiple different ways, but it gives you the high end of the usage of Sanskrit. At the low end of Sanskrit usage, there is something like Prakritized Sanskrit or Sanskritized Prakrit. But other people are also speaking these vernacular languages called Prakrits. And there are varieties of Sanskrit that sit in between. So there are some interesting examples that I want to give to you. One is that Patanjali mentions names of these sages. And he says these sages are called Yarvana Tarvana sages. That's the name. Then the question comes, well, why are these sages called Yarvana Tarvana? He says these sages speak proper Sanskrit, Yadvanaha or Tadvanaha during sacrifice, but when they come home, they say Yarvana and Tarvana. They don't speak Yadvanaha and Tadvana. So you can see now the gap. Proper Sanskrit is Yadvanaha or Tadvanaha, but home language of these rishis is Yarvana, Tarvana. So just as we get from Ekadasha to Gyaraha, something like that is happening here. From Yadva to Yarva. And you can see that almost like a gap like that between the languages, between dialects. The other interesting example is Patanjali says, if we don't study Sanskrit grammar, what will happen? Uh, he says, we will speak incorrect Sanskrit. Look at this girl who hasn't studied grammar and see how she speaks. And he quotes two phrases evidently as spoken by this girl who didn't study Sanskrit grammar. And she says, my eyes are beautiful and my feet are delicate. Well, that's such a nice description of her own eyes and feet. What's wrong with this? Okay. If you know Sanskrit grammar, what you see here, akshini me darshaniyani. This phrase uses akshini, eyes, plural. Now in Sanskrit, you have singular, dual, and then plural. The plural is used only for three and more. If it's two, you use dual. She is using plural. Same thing she does with her feet. Padame sukumaraha is using plural rather than dual. So Patanjali says she should have used dual while talking about her eyes and her feet. But she's not, she hasn't studied grammar. Okay, but we can look at this and find something else embedded in her speech. Why is she not using the dual? If you look at ancient Prakrits, as we see in Ashokan inscriptions, in the Pali language of the Buddhists or the Magadhi of the Jains, the category of dual is completely gone. It disappears from all these languages. So we can imagine that the high-end Sanskrit, as taught by Panini, has retained the category of dual, but it disappears in the colloquial forms of Sanskrit and Prakrit. And the girl is speaking this kind of Prakritized Sanskrit, where the category of dual is gone. It's not there. Okay, let's look at the next one. Okay. Again, some interesting descriptions about Sanskrit, who uses it, who speaks to whom. Okay. So again, around 150 BC, Patanjali, the grammarian, tells us, uh, the people, students ask him, do people speak Sanskrit everywhere in India? Patanjali says, no. Proper Sanskrit is spoken only in the region of Aryavarta. Because the next question then, what is this Aryavarta? So Patanjali says Aryavarta lies to the east of Punjab, where Saraswati disappears, to the west of Prayag, to the south of the Himalayas, and to the north of the Vindhyas. So we can imagine this central North India, east of Punjab, west of Prayag. Okay. That's the description of Aryavarta given by Patanjali. And the next question that comes up is, does everybody in Aryavarta speak proper Sanskrit? So Patanjali says no. Only the most learned Brahmins, only the most learned Brahmins speak proper Sanskrit. Not everybody. Okay. Now, do the learned Brahmins speak Sanskrit, proper Sanskrit at all times? Patanjali said no. They speak proper Sanskrit mainly during sacrifice. But on other occasions, use of Sanskrit is optional. That means they could be speaking Prakrit, some other vernacular language. And so this is a kind of a beautiful description of the situation of Sanskrit, who spoke it, and so on and so forth. Around 150 BC in this north central region of India called Aryavat. Okay, all right. Now, what happens in Sanskrit as it has come down to us from Panini onwards are the language that we find in Mahabharata, Ramayana, Kalidasa, and so on and so forth. In Panini's time, in his grammar, there is a description of dialects of Sanskrit. Panini himself says some usages are found in the northern region, some usages are found in the eastern region, some usages are attributed to Sakalya, some are attributed to Bharadwaja, and so on and so forth. So these are different dialects of Sanskrit. That means Sanskrit was not spoken as a homogenized language across this region, but there were dialects, local dialects. But language, as it comes in post-Paninian times, through literature and through conception of Sanskrit that develops in post-Paninian times is that of like a salad bowl where all dialects merge and a homogenized Sanskrit language is produced and used by the learned scholars. Okay. So the notion of dialects of Sanskrit disappears. History of Sanskrit disappears. And a homogenized Sanskrit is preserved through learning and used by the poets and philosophers. And also the nature of Sanskrit changes from a naturally spoken language of home to a learned language preserved with great effort by studying grammar and vocabulary and dictionaries and used in learned context. Okay. So words like Krunoti and Karoti at some point probably were dialect variations. Swasa and Bhagini were again probably dialects. But in later Sanskrit, we are told you can either say Krunoti or Karoti, it doesn't make any difference. Swasa or Bhagini doesn't make any difference. All these expressions are proper Sanskrit. Use whatever you think is appropriate in a given context. Now, if you look at standard dictionary, old dictionaries of Sanskrit, these are versified dictionaries of synonyms. Uh, for example, the famous Amarakosha. Amarakosha begins with a list of words which mean God. It says Amara, Nirjara, Devaha, Vidasha, Vibudha, Suraha. And so this is like a long list, 20, 30, 40 words are listed in Amarakosha. All of them mean, they're told, they mean Deva, the synonyms. Okay. Uh, if we would develop a conception that in a colloquial, naturally spoken home language, whenever Sanskrit was, that people use randomly, any one of these 40 words. That's just completely mistaken notion. Maybe people use the word deva or something like, as a common word. Well, why do we have Amara, Nirjara, Deva, Vibhuda, Tirdasha, all these 40 words? Okay. Choice of words in classical form of Sanskrit is now dictated by versification because of metrical foot of a line of a verse has to have a certain number of syllables. Syllables often need to come in an order of heavy and light, short and long. So that's one reason. Rhyming, alliteration, erudition, acrobatics, all these are practiced by Sanskrit authors to various degrees, and choice of vocabulary is done by looking at this rather than what would I use at home in my colloquial spoken Sanskrit. So language of literature is different from language used at home. That distinction often gets lost in our understanding of Sanskrit. Okay, okay. The language that has survived for us.
Frank talked with Captain Don on what's going on in Vermont Avenue, Beverly Boulevard. After the meeting, he came back to the car.
The language that has survived for us, Sanskrit that has survived for us, is not the colloquial language spoken at home. So that was not written down. That form of spoken Sanskrit did not survive. What survives is the language used in various shastras, kavyas, Sanskrit dramas, Sanskrit inscriptions, and so on and so forth. It is the language of Shastra and Kavya. It is the language of ritual, the language of logic, language of mathematics, Ayurveda, and so on and so forth, but not the language spoken at home. That language did not survive. We need to recreate that colloquial spoken language today if we want to talk at home using Sanskrit. That language spoken in ancient times at home has not survived. Okay. Now, just as standard Sanskrit has survived through Mahabharata, Ramayana, Kalidasa, and so on, non-standard forms of Sanskrit have also survived. Uh, They're less known to typical Sanskrit scholars, but there is extensive material, especially in Buddhist, Swami Jain tradition, and in hundreds of inscriptions from ancient India. A hybrid form of Sanskrit has survived. There is hybrid Buddhist Sanskrit literature, hybrid Jain Sanskrit, and hybrid inscriptional Sanskrit. And it has survived in very large quantity and is being studied today by modern scholars. Okay. So there was always continuous interaction between Sanskrit and the local vernacular languages. These languages often had different functions. So Sanskrit, for example, let's say, is used in ritual. But when the priest instructs the host, the priest instructs the host using the local vernacular language. When the priest recites the mantras, he recites the mantras in Sanskrit. But when the priest says, okay, now offer this to Satyanarayana, in Marathi they'll say, Satyanarayana Pulavaha, Dhupam, Dhup Dakwa. The instructions will be given in the local language. Because the instructions, if they are given in Sanskrit, will not be understood by the host. Similarly, often we find inscriptions use double languages. So, for example, a king giving donation of a village to a temple. The inscription is inscribed partly in Sanskrit. The Sanskrit part describes how great this king is, what wars he won, what is his dynasty, who are his ancestors. That part will come in Sanskrit. Then it switches to the vernacular because the name of the locality has to be given in the vernacular. Otherwise, the identity of that name will be confused. Similarly, the name of the recipient has to be given in that vernacular. That cannot be Sanskritized because that will be confused. And those details, this village, which is to the east of this other village, to the west of this other village, all those details often we find given in either Prakrit or in Tamil or Kannada, but some local language. And you can begin to see different functions of these languages. Okay. As the language becomes slowly the language of literature and not the language of home, certain things start happening. That the form of the language gets preserved more meticulously than the semantic distinctions between words. And when we say the Sanskrit has a very large number of synonyms, how did this large number of synonyms develop? The large number of synonyms develop by loss of nuances between those words over time, over a long period of time. And the same thing happens in Sanskrit grammar as well. So let's look at a few examples there. Okay. So this is just a casual example. Panini's grammar teaches that there are three different kinds of past tenses. So if we want to say he went home, we can say this in three ways. We can say this with agachat or jagama or agamat, three different forms. However, Panini gives different meanings to these three different forms. So agachat is used for non-today tense. It has to be yesterday and before. If we say jagama, then it means he went, but he went in absolutely remote past, unseen, mythical past, like Jagama. And if he went this morning, today, then we say Agamat. So Panini makes semantic distinctions between these three types of past tenses. But we are still studying Panini's grammar. And yet, when we look at Ramayana, Mahabharata, Kalidasa, look across the board. Agachat, Jagam, Agamat are used absolutely randomly. Whichever form suits the meter, the poet picks that form, not to make semantic difference between the past tenses. So this is one example. Let's see something else. Okay. The other thing that happens is that the distinction between obsolete vocabulary and more current vocabulary sometimes disappear because Sanskrit dictionary like Amarikosha give us large collections of words, some of which are obsolete, some are more current. But that distinction is not mentioned, it's not discussed clearly. And so occasionally the authors will use a word which is otherwise it has become obsolete. So uh, Shankaracharya wrote this famous prayer to Hari. He said, Harim Ede. The verb Ede means to pray to somebody. Harim Ide means I pray to Vishnu. However, Harim Ide, that verb Ede appears in the first line of Rigveda. And then it is very rare in intermediate literature. And suddenly it pops up in Shankaracharya Stotra that we can recite it every day. This Harimede. Tam samsara dvanta vinasham Harimede. It's a very popular stotra, one of the popular sutras of Shankaracharya. So suddenly an absolute word can be pulled and used. And so of course it's usable. Every absolute word is usable if you know what it means. How do we know what it means? If you have memorized Amarikosha, we know what it means. So just like that, tell us what this obsolete word means. And so an obsolete word can become current. Okay. The other thing that happens with literary Sanskrit is that Sanskrit becomes a word factory. So if we imagine that Sanskrit colloquially spoken at home would have a word like Nirupa or Raja, some word, some common word. I mean, in Marathi, when we want to talk about a king, we say Raja. We don't go on looking for other words. But literary Sanskrit becomes an infinite generative word factory. So we take any word which means man, person, world, Prithvi, and we add to it a word pati or pa, adipa, and the word comes to mean a king. So Nrupa, Nrupati, Narapati, Prithivipati, Lokapati, Vasudhapati, Vasudhadip. I mean, there is no end to how many words we can create, which all mean a king. What is the use of this? Poetry. In poetry, depending on how many words are left in our verse line, whether it is short, long, what is the structure of the syllable that we need to fill, we will pick Lokapati or Vasudhadhipa or Narapati, Nrupa, whatever. They all mean exactly the same thing. And yet, there's this great choice at the hand of the poet. So we can see literary Sanskrit and its behavior very different from what a colloquially spoken Sanskrit would be. Uh, it would have one of these words as a common word. Okay, next one. Okay, so now coming to modern times, uh, depending on who is studying Sanskrit, where they are studying Sanskrit, there are two variant approaches to studying Sanskrit. So first here we are looking at the Western concept of Sanskrit and how it is studied in the West. When we come to the West, again, the study of Sanskrit initially began by the colonial British officers, William Jones and others. Then it spread to uh, England and Germany and France. From there, it came also to United States. Uh, the earliest US scholars of Sanskrit had to go to Germany to learn Sanskrit. So around 1850, 1840, one of the scholars from Yale University went to Germany to study Sanskrit. And he came back and he became professor of Arabic and Sanskrit at Yale. He had apparently only one student for Sanskrit for his entire career, and that was William Dwight Whitney. So William Whitney got his PhD from Yale sometime around 1840, 1850. I'm missing the exact year. But William Whitney also went to Germany and he studied with a very famous German scholar. And with that German scholar, he collaborated in editing from manuscripts the first edition of the Atharva Veda. It was printed around 1850 from Berlin in Devanagari. It's amazing to see what these scholars are doing. Neither of them even went to India. But based on manuscripts that were brought to Europe, they printed this edition of Atharva Veda in German. Then Whitney came back and became professor of Sanskrit at Yale, and he did a full translation of the Atharva Veda, and he did numerous other works, scholarly works on Sanskrit. However, Whitney's approach to Sanskrit was that this is the language of the text that we are studying. We need to study only the forms of Sanskrit that appear in text, and we don't need to study forms that are theoretically possible. Why would we bother to study possible forms if at Yale and Chicago and Harvard and Germany and Cambridge and Oxford, all we are doing is studying only Sanskrit text. Okay. So for Whitney and others and numerous other people of that generation, Sanskrit was and remained a language of study of text. They never attempted or imagined themselves speaking Sanskrit, composing verses in Sanskrit, or using Sanskrit for any other purpose. And so this has been their approach to the study of Sanskrit until approximately 1950, 1960, when American scholars, European scholars started going to India, studying with Indian Pandits, and they came back with greater facility in living forms of Sanskrit. But this is a relatively recent development. But even then, very few Western scholars ever imagined themselves speaking Sanskrit or composing verses in Sanskrit. There are rare examples. A friend of mine, he is a German scholar, and he writes beautiful Sanskrit poetry, which is now being published in India. A collection of his Sanskrit poetry, authored by a German scholar, is being now. But this is an absolute rare example. That's not the normal thing. Let's look at the next. Okay. The concept of studying Sanskrit in India is a very different concept. For the Western scholarship always talks about the discovery of Sanskrit. Before William Jones, hardly anybody had studied Sanskrit directly, anybody from the West. There were a few Arabic scholars and a few Chinese scholars who had studied Sanskrit, but not any Western scholars. William Jones was the first one. So William Jones is often described as somebody who discovered Sanskrit. And people talk about impact of the discovery of Sanskrit on the field of linguistics as it developed in the West. And that's all real. For the West, Sanskrit was a discovered language. It was not part of their tradition, religious or linguistic. It was a discovered language. But the discovery had a great impact on the development of linguistics. In India, Sanskrit was never lost. India always had Sanskrit, it was never lost. It continues till today. Its, its fate has fluctuated depending on who the rulers were and so on and so forth. And yet, Sanskrit was never completely lost in India. So, when people study Sanskrit in India, they're studying a language which is to some extent still a living literary, at least literary language, language of ritual. And there are multiple forms of colloquially spoken Sanskrit that are practiced today. So one end of contemporary spoken Sanskrit is Sanskrit uh, practiced by, for example, this institution called Sanskrit Bharati, and you have probably branches uh, in Washington area, and they're spread all across. Sanskrit Bharati is trying to inculcate Sanskrit as a modern, colloquially spoken language in the environment of the modern contemporary world. So, what are all the objects inside our home? Television, telephone, car, airport, train, airplane. We should have words for all these objects and be able to speak Sanskrit. So, a colloquial form of Sanskrit being actively developed and taught by organizations like Sanskrit Bharati is one end of study of Sanskrit. The other end of study of Sanskrit within India is if you go to Shankaracharya Monastery in Kanchi or Sringeri, there Sanskrit Pandits are debating classical texts, classical doctrines, classical philosophy, branches of Vedanta, they're debating with each other. They are discussing issues of Sanskrit grammar and Panini in classical Sanskrit. The language that they use hasn't changed much from the language used by Shankaracharya or by Kalidas or by Panini for that matter. These Pandits are not using language that has words for trains and telephone and planes and whatnot. So a Pandit form of Sanskrit is cultivated in monasteries and pathshalas in various parts of India. Various poets today are writing beautiful Sanskrit poetry. Uh, there are many journals in India that publish Sanskrit poetry composed by modern poets. Myself, I've been writing Sanskrit poetry now for many years. I've started writing verses on Krishna about 4 years ago. By now, I've composed about 1,500 verses, and it will be published as a collection of poetry in the near future. So there are two layers of Sanskrit being practiced in India today. One layer is Pandit form, poets writing poetry in Sanskrit, and Pandits debating in Sanskrit. That's one form. The other layer is actively teaching how to speak Sanskrit in the contemporary world, contemporary environment. And these two forms of Sanskrit do not necessarily speak to each other, uh, nor do they have vocabularies that can be used. The grammar remains pretty much the same. Vocabulary change, and they don't necessarily talk to each other. They don't necessarily have the same goals, and therefore we currently see these two streams, parallel streams of study of Sanskrit in India. The fate of Sanskrit sort of goes up and down. Coming up, Islam did something, but I think it's a misnomer to believe that Sanskrit did not prosper during the Mughal period or other Muslim kingdoms in India, because we have at the court of Jahangir, at the court of Shah Jahan, there were Sanskrit Pandits, the great Pandit Jagannath, the great poet, was at the court of Shah Jahan. And Aurangzeb's brother Dara Shikoh got Upanishads translated, Mahabharata translated into Persian, Ramayana translated into Persian, and Ayurveda works are translated into Persian. So again, there is no inherent conflict of Islam and study of Sanskrit. Depending on who that individual ruler was, during Aurangzeb's rule, things changed. These were different during times of Akbar, Jahangir, Shah Jahan, they were different. Same thing we find in Bahman.
Woman attorney Martha Ellis Bryant.
So this is where I want to stop right now, and I will be happy to take a few questions.